We are almost through with the first part of Luke. Jesus has been performing a lot of miracles, signs, we call them, that demonstrate the kind of kingdom that Jesus is bringing. By the time we get into chapter 10, Jesus has revealed a lot about himself. And so Peter, representing all the disciples, has acknowledged Jesus to be the Christ, the promised Messiah. In this session, we're going to see Jesus do an initial commissioning of his disciples for the ministry he wants them to carry on after he's gone. In the first 12 verses of chapter 10, Jesus sends out 72 of his followers to heal the sick and preach the kingdom. By the way, that number 72 is significant because in the famous table of nations in Genesis 10, there were 72 nations listed. So 72 here is a way of indicating that Jesus' gospel is going to be for the entire world. And so the disciples go out and they do this ministry, and when they get back, as part of their debriefing, Jesus tells them a parable that illustrates the kind of heart that he wants to see developed in all those of us who represent him. This parable all starts in verse 25 with a trap question that was asked by a Pharisee, by a lawyer. Here's what it says, verse 25. Then an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus, saying, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Verse 26, Jesus said, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" Verse 27, the lawyer answered, "Well, you got to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and then love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly." Jesus told him, "Do this and you will live." Y'all, I almost want to laugh out loud when I read that. I mean, that is a big old do, right? Right, yeah, just love God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, and mind every second of every day. Make God the highest passion of your heart, the one you think about first and foremost in every decision you make. And also, while you're at it, love everybody else as much as you love yourself. Care about your neighbor's needs as much as you do your own. Rejoice in their happiness as much as you do yours. Worry about their futures and weep about their sorrows as if they were your own. And when you do that, then you'll be ready for heaven. Anybody here in the group want to raise their hand right now and say, "Oh yeah, that describes my week"? Yeah, that's how you would describe me. Anybody's hand raised? Of course not. Verse 29, watch this. The lawyer, wanting to justify himself, that's a key word, asked Jesus, well, then who is my neighbor? And so Jesus tells a story that shows that this commandment has no limits, that true followers of Jesus have, and here's a key word, have an instinct that makes them move toward need and toward suffering wherever and whenever they encounter it. You see, let me back up for just a minute and set this conversation in the larger context of Jesus' overall message. The main problem with how this lawyer phrased his question is that there is nothing we can do to inherit eternal life. If there had been something we could do, Jesus would not have had to come to rescue us. The whole point of Jesus' life is that we could not earn our way to heaven, so Jesus came to do it for us by living the life that we were supposed to live and then dying the death that we were condemned to die in our place. This religious leader, this lawyer, was looking for a set of to-do items on a list that he could perform and check off. But read this parable primarily as a description of the kind of love and generosity that grows in your heart naturally after you've met Jesus and been saved by grace. Verse 30, here's the parable. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and so this man fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him, beat him up, and fled, leaving him half dead. Now, verse 31, a priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Now, when I learned this story when I was in Sunday school on, flannel graph, we were always really, really hard on this priest. I think I can even remember the expression on the face of the flannel graph character that my teacher put up to represent the priest. He had this pious, "I'm better than you" look on his face, and we just assumed that he was stepping over a bleeding man on his way to the donut shop or something like that. But Jesus' audience would have immediately recognized a few things about this priest that would have made him a much more sympathetic character. First of all, the Jericho Road was extremely dangerous. It was literally called in those days the Pass of Blood because of all those places that robbers could hide. The one rule on the Jericho Road is you don't stop. It'd be like driving through a really dangerous part of town late at night. You don't just stop because if you do, you might get mugged. Second, If this priest was returning from Jerusalem, that means that he had just finished up his purification rites at the temple there, which were required in order for him to be able to perform his religious duties back in his hometown. And that purification was a 7-day process. And according to Jewish law, if you touched a dead man after you'd been purified, well, you had to go back to the temple in Jerusalem and purify yourself all over again, which would take another 7 days. So in other words, for this priest to stop and help this guy would have been both dangerous and massively inconvenient, because this guy was likely to die, which might have been a decent excuse by this priest, except that this man on the side of the road is dying. And what Jesus is asking is, isn't a man's life worth at least a week of this priest's time? Verse 32, in the same way, a Levite, when he arrived at the place and saw him, he also passed by on the other side. Verse 33, but a Samaritan on his journey came up to him. When he saw the man, he had compassion. A couple of things here. First, if you're familiar with the Bible at all, you know that Samaritans were the ethnic and religious enemies of the Jews. The Samaritans were the half-Jew, half-Gentile offspring that came about when the Assyrians, who had conquered the northern part of Israel, forced the Jews there to intermarry with them. The Jews thought of Samaritans as racially defiled, half-bloods, or for you Harry Potter fans, mudbloods. They were extremely racist toward the Samaritans. The Samaritans, for their part, weren't really that pleasant of a people either. They built their own alternate temple, and they said that their altar, not the one in Jerusalem, but their altar was the true altar of God. Samaria was right in the middle of the northern and southern parts of Israel, but the Jews hated Samaritans so much that if they were traveling from north to south in Israel, they would walk around Samaria, even though it added a couple of days to their journey, just to avoid contact with those dirty Samaritans. Just touching a Samaritan, they believe, would make you defiled. But shockingly, in Jesus' story, this Samaritan, when he sees the bleeding Jewish man, he feels compassion. And by the way, the word compassion is one of my favorite Greek words. Splagma refers to a pity that just rises up from the core of who you are. It's like this gut-wrenching compassion, which is why it sounds like vomit, splagma, right? Verse 34, he went over to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on olive oil and wine. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him. When I come back, I'll reimburse you for whatever extra you spend. He paid for the guy, in other words, out of his own account. He even opened up a line of credit for him so that whatever he needed would be addressed. What do you notice here, by the way, about the Samaritan's love? It's unrestrained, it's limitless. He literally opens a line of credit and says, whatever it takes to get this guy back to health, put that on me. Then Jesus asked, verse 36, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Verse 37, the one who showed mercy to him, the lawyer said. By the way, did you see that? This Jewish lawyer cannot even bring himself to say the Samaritan. He just says, that one who showed mercy to him. And then Jesus told him, you go and do the same. In this story, Jesus shows us what it means to love our neighbors, and then why those of us who've been saved by grace will do it instinctively. So number 1, what it means to love our neighbors. Let me subdivide the what question into the who, the when, and the how much. Okay, so first, who do we love? And the answer is anyone we see in need. The Samaritan and the Jew could not have had less in common. And see, it's natural for us to help those who are like us, those with whom we have an affinity, or those that we think are in some way deserving of our help. But Jesus taught that we are to help those, especially those with whom we have little in common, even those we might consider our enemies, or those we think are unworthy of our help, which could mean those on the other side of the political aisle from you, or the immigrant family living in your neighborhood, or the boss at work who is taking you for granted and consistently failed to acknowledge your efforts, or the person who sits on the other side of the classroom who is just so different from you, or the friend who betrayed you. It also includes people around the world and cultures vastly different from your own. It's literally anybody in need, regardless of who they are, or how they got there, or whether you have any personal connection to them or not, which leads me to the when question. When do we show love? Jesus' answer in this parable is whenever you see the need. Listen, we come up with all kinds of excuses for why not to help somebody in need. We say things like, well, I don't mind helping people who are truly victims of injustice, but those people over there, that group over there, they don't really deserve our help because their suffering is their fault. If anybody ever had an excuse not to show kindness, it was this Samaritan. It serves you right, you bigot. You sow the wind, reap the whirlwind. But the Samaritan showed mercy because he was moved with splagma, with compassion. Proverbs 3:27 says, do not withhold good from your neighbor when it is in your power to act, which means if you have the opportunity to act, you have the responsibility to act. Third, how much love should we show? Well, again, based on the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus' answer is, until we are sharing in the burden ourselves. This Samaritan put himself at great personal risk and then used his own money to meet the need. The essence of love is when you begin to share in someone else's burden. Listen, you cannot meet every need of every person in the world, but to love somebody means to share in their pain, which means that through your generosity, you enter into their pain to the point that you begin to feel some of it yourself. Paul said in the book of Galatians, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. In other words, the way you love like Jesus is to give to the point that you are sharing in the burden. And until you yourself are feeling some of the weight of that burden, well, you're not really loving or giving like Jesus. Friend, listen, this is the core of what it means to follow Jesus. And let me say something really serious here. Christians often function like that priest and the Levite in Jesus' story. We're all into our religious duties, reading our Bibles and tithing and volunteering and going to small groups. We do all of our duties. But when you actually look at our lives, there's very little sharing in the burdens of others or truly giving ourselves away. Yeah, we throw our money at things. We give a little off the top. But the essence of following Jesus is entering into the pain of others. Okay, so that's what it means to love our neighbors, right? So now let's end with why those of us who are saved by grace love our neighbors instinctively. Jesus puts an interesting twist into the story. The twist is he uses a Samaritan as the hero. Did he really need to do that? So here's the question that you need to consider. If the main point of the story was simply that we should love anybody we see in need, well, Jesus didn't need to make a Samaritan the hero to make that point, right? But instead, Jesus made a Samaritan, whom they considered to be their enemy, the hero of this story. Why? Well, let me ask you a second question. Who do you think is supposed to represent this lawyer and you and me in this story? Which character represents us? See, we typically read this story, we say, I know. I'm like the busy priest and the uncaring Levite, but I should really be more like the Good Samaritan. But what if the person that you and I are supposed to most identify with in this story is not the priest or the Levite or the Good Samaritan? What if the person we are most supposed to identify with is the guy bleeding on the side of the road? And what if somebody who had every reason to hate us and to be our enemy instead chose to put himself into danger to rescue us? What if the true Good Samaritan is Jesus, who took upon himself the suffering that we had caused ourselves, who stopped to help us, who not only put himself in danger, but actually yielded his body up to real death to save us, and who then gives us an unlimited credit at the bank of his grace to cover whatever else we need, who promises to supply all of our need according to his riches? And what if Jesus did that even though our situation was our own fault and we did not deserve any help? See, if that's true, and we are the man on the side of the road who got rescued, well, see, that changes how we approach others in need, right? You see, Jesus is not giving the lawyer a new rule as much as he is making him aware of a new reality. Each of us had made God our enemy, and instead of hating us, God saw us and he felt splagma, compassion. You and I are saved, you see, because Jesus stopped, because he turned aside to help us, because he got involved in our pain, even though he didn't have to. And it is simply not possible for you and me to experience that kind of grace and not develop an instinct to show that kind of grace to others. And see, if you haven't developed that instinct, Jesus is asking, have you really experienced my grace? Are you even saved? Jesus is not giving this lawyer a new standard to reach so that he can earn heaven, because there's no standard that we could reach to earn heaven. He's saying that God saved us by a gift of outlandish grace. And if we understand that, The way that we will show that is by showing outlandish grace to others. The indicator light on your dashboard that shows that you have experienced the grace of God is that you develop an instinct to show it to others, because, you see, those who believe the gospel always become like the gospel. And so, if you have experienced the grace of Jesus and the gospel, well, like Jesus said to the lawyer, go and do likewise.